What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we got a good one for you guys. In today's video, we're going to be going over the tight ends that you should not have drafted. I will say right off the bat that there really aren't that many tight ends that I think are coming in at an unfair ADP, but overall, we do have to make choices in our drafts, and the tight ends that I did include in this video are unlikely to be on any of our teams. Before we do get into the video though, just a quick shout out and reminder that if you do enjoy these videos, the best way to show your support is simply by hitting that like button. As you may know, we are on the road to 100k subscribers and we are inching close to it. Our goal is to hit that by the start of the NFL season, so if you're new to the channel, maybe you haven't subscribed yet, consider taking today as an opportunity to do so, and while you're at it, if you enjoy, hit that like button and let us know. Also, guys, be advised, our draft packages are currently available now, so if you want access to our tier-based rankings, our sleepers, our targets, our busts, risk ratings, player projections, video player breakdowns on the top 150 players, access to our private Discord community group, and more. What are you waiting for? You can get that at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link, as always, in the description box below. With that being said, though, it's time to hop over to our stat of the day. And yesterday's stat of the day was who was the oldest quarterback to have at least 80 rushing yards in a single game last season. The correct answer was actually Russell Wilson. Congratulations to Ren Reginaldo, the first to get this right on YouTube. And as for Twitter, at Hayden_1132. Once again, congratulations to both of you. But as for today's stat of the day, which team had the most fumbles lost per game last season? Once again, that's which team in 2020 had the most fumbles lost per game. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Without further ado though, we'll hop right into the video, and as per usual, we'll begin with the player listed on the thumbnail. It's Evan Engram of the New York Giants. Now admittedly, it's hard to paint Evan Engram as one of the worst picks in the draft, let alone at the tight end position, simply because his ADP is coming outside of the top 12. That's vastly different than what his ADP typically is or has been in previous seasons. But when it comes to Evan Engram, he's a player that does still bring in a bit of name value. So in home leagues, this is a player that I can see people reaching on easily. If you're able to land him as your last pick, or at least one of your last picks before your kicker and defense, I can't say that picking Evan Engram as a second tight end, one that you don't rely on, one that doesn't need to start, I can't say that's necessarily the worst pick you could make. But if you're drafting him as your lone tight end, somebody expected to be the starter, expectations for Evan Engram should be adjusted when compared to prior seasons. For starters, we've seen the production that Evan Engram has been producing on a per game basis drop off in every season since his rookie year, ultimately reaching a pinnacle in the 2020 season where he actually appeared in a full 16 games, uncharacteristic for Evan Engram himself, but in those 16 games, he received a whopping 109 targets, only converting 63 of them into receptions for 654 receiving yards to go along with one lone touchdown. Don't get me wrong, I know that Daniel Jones was not the best quarterback for fantasy purposes for any receivers, but Evan Engram really doesn't deserve any excuses. His catchable target percentage was 77%, which was still within the top 20. He also ranked second in the league in the area of drops, ultimately dropping 10 passes. And when looking at other simple metrics about how efficient he was on a per target basis, yards per target, he ranked 33rd at the position, yards per reception, 55th. So as many excuses as we want to make for Evan Engram and the lack of production in 2020, the truth is he played extremely poorly. Now heading into 2021, he's going to have more competition for targets than ever. Even if he does appear in 16 games, which we'll get to in a moment, Evan Engram is very unlikely to receive the same number of targets as he did a season ago. The New York Giants are heading into 2021 with the following receivers. You have Sterling Shepard, Darius Slayton, Kadarius Toney, the rookie they drafted in the first round. On top of that, they have free agent receivers like Kenny Golladay and John Ross, both of which are currently dealing with injuries but are likely to at least be on the team and starting for the roster as early as week 1, possibly a few weeks after, but drafting Evan Engram in the hopes that the other receivers will remain injured for the entire season is just a losing proposition. And when it comes to the tight end position, we cannot forget that the team signed Kyle Rudolph as a veteran presence. Kyle Rudolph, while he is more likely to play the blocking role for this team, either way it's undeniable that there will be times that Kyle Rudolph is on the field that previously and in prior seasons would have formerly gone to Evan Engram. Engram, and while that could help to keep Evan Engram healthy, counting on Evan Engram to once again play another 16-game season is just an unlikely expectation. Last season was actually the first and only time that throughout Evan Engram's career he was actually able to appear in 16 games. The closest he's came to it was his rookie season where he appeared in 15, but in the two prior seasons before 2020, Evan Engram only appeared in 19 of a possible 32 games. So when we're taking into consideration all the factors surrounding Evan Engram, for starters, the New York Giants offense, it's not going to be one of those offenses we want to target players on and get as many as we possibly can. Scoring opportunities will be a bit few and far between when compared to other tight ends that you could be targeting, and when it comes to his competition for targets, this season he's going to have more than ever. He also has another tight end that's going to be competing when it comes to his snap share. Not to mention, even when given the targets, Evan Engram has not been producing, ranking second in the entire league in the area of drops with 10, ranking 55th in the area of yards per reception. So even if he does finish the season ranking within the top 10 in the area of targets, that doesn't necessarily mean it will translate to top 10 in fantasy production. In fact, quite the opposite. And lastly, when taking into consideration his history when it comes to health and availability, Engram's not even a player we can rely on to play 16 games or anything close to it. So all that adds up to a player that we should just avoid on draft day. Like I mentioned, his ADP is coming in a range where it's unlikely he will be the reason your team loses, but missing out on one of those valuable late round picks where we're trying to target those players with top 20 upside, I just feel it's better used in other places. And in this range, there are many other tight ends that we feel you should be targeting in his place. Alright guys, we're moving into the next tight end. It's Dallas Goedert of the Philadelphia Eagles. Unlike Evan Engram, Dallas Goedert's actually going in a range of the draft where there are very valuable players still left on the board. Currently, in 3 out of the 5 most popular platforms to draft on, Dallas Goedert has an ADP inside the top 81, and in your run-of-the-mill 12-team leagues, that's going to equate to about a 7th round pick. That may not sound like you're giving up too much in order to draft a tight end with upside, but you're still giving up the final stage of the draft where you can actually get running backs with guaranteed volume, running backs like Damian Harris, Chase Edmonds, both players projected to go in the 7th round. In looking at wide receivers being drafted in that range, some names of note: Laviska Shenault, Michael Gallup, Juju Smith-Schuster, and DJ Chark. If you've done mock drafts, you know exactly how much the running back position drops completely off of a cliff after this range, so taking a tight end when you could have invested that pick into a running back to bolster up your depth, it definitely would be the route that I would take, especially when I believe that Dallas Goedert doesn't have any more upside or safety than some of the other tight ends being drafted much later. Now initially, when we were heading into the offseason with the expectation that Zach Ertz was going to be traded, Dallas Goedert looked like a premier tight end at the position, especially with the ambiguity of how the wide receiver position would pan out this season. The Philadelphia Eagles let go of veterans on that team like Alshon Jeffrey, paving the way for first-round picks Devontae Smith and Jalen Reagor to lead this team from a receiver position. They still have some of the other players like Travis Fulgham who stepped up at times last season, but at least when it came to Dallas Goedert, we knew what type of results we could expect as long as he was on the field. That will still remain true. I do believe Dallas Goedert, on a per target basis, he is going to be a player to find success at the tight end position, but with him now competing with Zach Ertz when it comes to snaps and targets, even with the Philadelphia Eagles playing 2 tight end sets at a higher rate than nearly any other team in the league, it's still going to overall be a limiting factor of Dallas Goedert. In fact, if I were to actually target one of the 2 tight ends between Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert, it's undeniable Zach Ertz is going to be the player I'm targeting. He's coming in massively undervalued right now. In ESPN leagues, he's coming off the board 247th overall. Even in Yahoo leagues, the platform that has the highest price tag for tight ends across the board, he's still coming in 197th overall. And if you guys have been paying attention throughout this offseason and training camp, Zach Ertz has actually been having a phenomenal offseason. If we are expecting the total snap share between both Dallas Goedert and Zach Ertz to be relatively similar, and in 2 tight end sets, we can't say for certain which player is going to be the favorite when it comes to targets. Having a discrepancy of Dallas Goedert being drafted in the 9th round compared to Zach Ertz, a player playing a very similar role in the same exact offense, being drafted over 100 picks later, yes, I'm going to opt to take the value in Zach Ertz if I am trying to get a piece of this offense. That would allow me to still grab those players like I mentioned, those Chase Edmonds, those Damian Harrises, while still getting a tight end with a similar amount of upside and a very similar floor. With that being said though, I also can't fault other players that just crossed Dallas Goedert off their list, trying to avoid the dumpster fire that could possibly be the Philadelphia Eagles offense. With Jalen Hurts the projected starter, somebody that they were a bit non-committal on this season, it's not even clear exactly how good he will be as a passer. From what we saw last season, it was very hit or miss. On top of that, the Philadelphia Eagles don't exactly have the best track record when it comes to standing behind their starting quarterback, so if he does inevitably deal with some adversity, how confident can we be that the Eagles coaching staff will stand behind him and allow him to deal with those ups and downs, develop as the season goes on, or how quick will they be to pull the trigger on benching him, creating yet another QB controversy with the newly signed Gardner Minshew, a player that they got for a 6th round pick. So overall, when it comes to Dallas Goedert this upcoming season, I just think his ADP is a bit too high. When you compare his floor and ceiling, it's much more similar to the players being drafted behind him, those Tyler Higbees and Logan Thomases, players that we do have listed as strong targets. And considering the fact that you can get the counterpart to Dallas Goedert, Zach Ertz, a player who has had a track record of success with the exception of last season, you can get him over 100 picks later. So to me, even if I was a person heavily targeting Dallas Goedert, I may opt to just take the draft day discount and get a player in the same offense with Zach Ertz, save myself a 7th round pick while also getting a piece of this passing offense if I strongly believe that the Philadelphia Eagles will be an offense to target this year. Alright guys, we're moving into the next player, or should I say players, because I'm going to mix in a few tight ends in this one because they're all going in a similar range. These are going to be the tight ends being drafted in the early to middle rounds outside of the 3 elite tight ends. This is going to consist of Kyle Pitts, Mark Andrews, and TJ Hawkinson. And just to be clear, each one individually, I'm not saying that they are destined to bust. They all do have their own risk factors associated with them. We'll get into the specifics surrounding each player, but the point I'm trying to make in this video, and the reason I included all 3 of them, is just to let you guys know that these players are going in a stage of the draft that I feel your picks are better used at other positions. I feel strongly that when you compare the 2 picks, if you take a tight end early, opting not to draft a receiver or running back at that spot, if you compare that to the value you would have gained if you took one of the later tight ends that we do have listed as targets, then instead of investing that early round pick into a tight end, you invest that into a skill position player or maybe an elite quarterback. I feel strongly that when you leave the draft, that the skill position player that you would have drafted in place of that tight end would more than make up for the loss in fantasy points when comparing the late round tight end to your early round tight end. For example, in our tight ends that you should have drafted video that was posted earlier on this week, we listed players like Tyler Higbee, Robert Tonyan, Logan Thomas, all as excellent picks in the later rounds that cost a fraction of the investment of the other players like TJ Hawkinson, Mark Andrews, and Kyle Pitts. For starters, looking at each player's fantasy points per game, we really can't take a look at the fantasy points per game for Kyle Pitts, so we'll shelve him for a second. But taking a look at TJ Hawkinson last season and Mark Andrews last season, Mark Andrews, this was an area where he actually ranked 4th in, ultimately finishing the year with 12.15 PPR fantasy points per game. Looking over at TJ Hawkinson though, he was no slouch either. We know he had his semi-breakout last year, and he actually finished in fantasy points per game as the tight end 7. However, if we compare that to the fantasy points per game from other players that we think are good targets that are going much later, like Logan Thomas and Robert Tonyan. Logan Thomas last season finished 5th in fantasy points per game, ultimately finishing with 11 per game. That was outpacing TJ Hawkinson just behind Mark Andrews. And as for Robert Tonyan, this was a player who also finished with 11 fantasy points per game, just a hair behind Logan Thomas, ranking 6th. So looking at Mark Andrews, he ranked 4th, Logan Thomas ranked 5th, Tonyan ranked 6th, and Hawkinson ranked 7th. The difference in fantasy points per game between each player is very negligible, and if they were to repeat the same type of production, I think we could all agree that saving ourselves an early round pick and investing that into either an elite quarterback or a skill position player ranking inside the top 30, I think we all could agree that if they were to repeat themselves in terms of production, the gap in production would not be enough to constitute losing out on such a valuable early round pick. Now, obviously, comparing last season's production to what we can expect this season, it's not an exact science, and Logan Thomas and Robert Tonyan certainly could disappoint when compared to last season's production, but with Logan Thomas having an upgrade at quarterback, going from Dwayne Haskins and Taylor Heineke and Alex Smith to now Ryan Fitzpatrick. On top of that, we're expecting the Washington football team offense to take a step forward. They're bringing back Terry McLaurin, Antonio Gibson. They also signed Curtis Samuel off free agency, and with him being injured, possibly to start the early season, this could be a good opportunity for Logan Thomas to build his chemistry up with Ryan Fitzpatrick, who throughout training camp have already been reported to have a good connection in the red zone. As for Robert Tonyan, this is another player who has been hyped up throughout training camp to have a good chemistry and connection with Aaron Rodgers, something that we saw present itself last season. Tonyan was a tight end that ranked near the top of the league in many efficiency areas like fantasy points per target, fantasy points per route run, yards per target, catch rate, true catch rate. So it's no wonder why heading into this offseason, Robert Tonyan was a player that they projected to have an increased role, and so far everything that we've heard and seen out of training camp has fully supported that. Yes, they brought in Randall Cobb as an aging wide receiver to help between the 20s, but Robert Tonyan is still going to play a major role in the red zone. We cannot forget his 11 touchdowns last season, ranked first at the position, and with Aaron Rodgers throughout his career being one of the most efficient quarterbacks not only between the 20s but also within the red zone, Robert Tonyan isn't going to require a massive uptick in volume in order to produce similar numbers to what he did last season, but even with that being the case, we fully expect him to increase his role. So each player I just mentioned, Logan Thomas and Robert Tonyan, there is a case for them to maintain their fantasy production from last season and possibly increase it. When it comes to Mark Andrews, I fully expect him to maintain his fantasy production, but it's difficult to make a strong case for him to increase it. TJ Hawkinson, on the other hand, there is a case for him to potentially take that next step and knock on the door of those elite tight ends. It would have to have a lot of things working in his favor. More specifically, TJ Hawkinson is expected to play an increased role this upcoming season for the Detroit Lions, now led by Jared Goff, formerly Matthew Stafford, and with Kenny Golladay and Marvin Jones, the team's two top receivers last season and for the several seasons prior to that, with them leaving in free agency, it leaves a subpar wide receiver core with receivers like Brashad Perriman and Tyrell Williams, rookie Amon St. Brown, and when looking at the wide receiver group as a whole, it's easy to see how TJ Hawkinson can be one of the primary receivers in this offense and potentially compete to lead this team in targets. With that being said, I'm not going to sit here and bash TJ Hawkinson and say he doesn't have the upside to compete with even the elite tight ends if everything goes his way. Let's say TJ Hawkinson performs very efficiently. Hawkinson does in fact lead this team in targets and Jared Goff plays some of his best football of his career, then in that case, yes, drafting TJ Hawkinson over opting to wait and draft some of the other tight ends I mentioned, it could definitely pay dividends for you and ultimately be the right choice for fantasy. But just as likely as that is as an outcome, equally I think that we have to take into consideration an Evan Engram-esque type season could be in line for TJ Hawkinson. One thing that we've learned over the years is just because you get an increase in volume doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate to an increase in fantasy points. Efficiency can easily drop off, especially if the offense is read like an open book by opposing defenses, and if TJ Hawkinson is the only true real threat in this passing offense, then defenses are going to know how to adjust to mitigate the fantasy points, mitigate the production out of Hawkinson, and if that were the case, then even if he were to produce career highs in terms of targets, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to meet his career highs in terms of fantasy points per game. TJ Hawkinson, Kyle Pitts, and Mark Andrews are all projected to come off the board in the 5th round. That's exactly the area we like to target quarterbacks like Kyler Murray and Josh Allen, wide receivers like Cooper Kupp, Brandon Ayuk. These are still players that are on the board in that same range. And if you're thin at running back, depth pieces like Mike Davis, Kareem Hunt, and even Darrell Henderson are all players that you could get in the same range of these tight ends. If we're looking at skill position player and tight end combination between an early round tight end and a late round tight end, having a combination of a player like Darrell Henderson and Logan Thomas, to me it's going to feel much better than getting a combination of TJ Hawkinson and a handcuff running back. So while this really shouldn't be looked at as avoiding these players because I completely hate their situations, I'm not against Mark Andrews this season, I'm not against TJ Hawkinson this season, but I feel like the value that you're going to lose on by drafting a tight end in that stage of the draft, you're ultimately going to be doing your team a disservice because there's so much value at the tight end position at the later stages of the draft. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching and we'll catch you on the next one.